Hey gang, it's Ruben. Welcome back to the Placebo Effect podcast. I'm super thrilled for my next guest. My next guest is Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins, who I met on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it. Ben is what we call a counter apologist. We'll get into that. And he and his buddies are running a pretty interesting podcast themselves called Real Atheology. Ben, what's going on, my friend? How are you?
Ruben, thank you for having me on today. And for all your listeners out there, yes, Blake Speed is my real middle name. If you type
For
in
real?
Benjamin Blake Speed, yeah, my parents were eccentric like that, and gave the three of my two other siblings and myself four names. So all
So
four of
like
us have.
River Phoenix, like one of those? Are you a flower child?
Yeah, it's more or less something like that. My brother is actually named Wales Remington Sharp Watkins. So Wales like the country and Remington like the gun.
Man, I
And then
dig
Sharp.
that name.
Yeah, and so Speed is a family name on my side as well. And then
Is your
Blake comes from William Blake.
Oh, nice. Is your brother older than you?
He's younger than me. He's about 3.5, 4 years younger than me. And then our little sister is 17 years younger than me. So my parents spread us out.
Gotcha. Okay. And we'll get into the family background a little bit more because I definitely want to hear some of your origin story, so to speak. But I guess let's kind of first start with the term counter apologetics, right? Because you and I both are in this whole front lines. Let's have the debate. I clearly come from now the theistic worldview. I'm trying to defend the faith as a believer in God and in Christ. And we, meaning the theistic folks, use the term counter apologetics for the counter belief, which is you, the non-believer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's more or less right. Certainly my co-hosts, Justin Schieber and Ben Bavar, we've reluctantly taken on the label of counter apologists because really our project was focused on doing. Our project is called Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. So we like to think of ourselves first and foremost as philosophers of religion, but certainly apologetics and counter apologetics is a secondary feature of that project because the people that we engage with the most are people in apologetic circles. So we've, obviously interacted with people like Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity and Trent Horn from his ministry. And so we certainly have a lot of our friends and connections within apologetic circles, whereas it's more of us bringing philosophy of religion to those circles than it is us actually going out and engaging with in the philosophy of religion literature. So we bring the literature to the apologetics community rather than actively participating in writing that literature. But that's soon going to change here. I've got a chapter in a book coming up with a couple of other philosophers of religion soon. So this is my first time being professionally published. So I'm really excited about getting that, kind of out in the sphere. But certainly what we want to do is give both apologists and counter-apologists the resources that they need to kind of tackle the big questions in the philosophy of religion, as well as raising the discourse within the apologetics community and counter-apologetics circles, because certainly the philosophy of religion in those circles can leave something to be desired quite frequently. But I think that what we in a couple of other podcasts have really been able to bring as a contribution to these circles is giving both sides the best versions of argument, certain types of arguments on both sides of these questions. So, for example, the arguments from natural theology, as well as the atheological arguments, things like the argument from evil and the argument from hiddenness, helping bring these resources to these discussions so that people can think about these big questions in serious ways.
Well, and we may touch on some of those a little bit. I can tell you for sure, I am not a philosopher. I don't even like spend much time doing it as a hobby. That's not to say that I haven't like looked at some of the arguments critically. I think that we kind of owe ourselves to do that to some degree, and we may chop it up a little bit in that area. But one thing at a time. Let's back up the bus for a second, Ben, because I want people to hear some of your origin story in the sense of what led you to where you are today. Now, in reading your bio on the Real Atheology website, not only were you brought up in a Christian background, but my goodness, it sounds like it was pretty unique in the sense that you added the background story of from a Quaker style of faith. And I only read about them in history. I didn't know there were active Quakers today. Tell us a little bit about your growing up in a Quaker household and how your life journey kind of took you away from the faith.
Yeah, so I was raised in Columbia, South Carolina, in a conservative, non-denominational kind of offshoot from a more mainstream Quaker denomination, and so the thrust of the religious tradition that I grew up in is, if you were to go and look it up online, it would be called the 2x2s, or what is often called the truth with a capital T. And so the emphasis was not so much on an established church, like a building of worship, but we went instead to people's houses. People would host us, and they were what were called meetings. And so it was called the 2x2s because what were called the preachers in our tradition were called workers. And so these workers would travel in pairs, 2x2s, either two females or two males. And so they would go from meeting to meeting in different areas, and they were basically our spiritual shepherds in this tradition. And so it was very conservative in the sense that women wore dresses, always wore their hair up. There was, things like cursing were frowned upon. We'd never had, growing up, a television or a Christmas tree. Those were considered idolatrous. And so it's definitely a Protestant tradition that takes a lot of the scripture literally. And so come about the age of 22, 23 for myself, I had just completed an engineering degree. And so was kind of out on my own, and was basically going through all of these, big struggles that come along with being in your early 20s of, well, where do I fall politically? Where do I fall spiritually? Where do I, how does personal finance work? What are my hobbies? What is going to be my career? How, these were just all big questions that I was kind of wrestling with. And so obviously the faith that I grew up in was a big piece of that. And I was dating my now current wife, who was raised Catholic. And so we had obviously had conversations about, well, if we have kids, how are we going to raise them? How essential a feature is religion going to be in their lives? And so
hold on. This is getting really interesting now. So you're still have this fundamentalist Puritan Quaker
Protestant tradition, dating
belief, right?
a Catholic.
And you're dating a Catholic. Like, were you guys rock paper scissors to decide whose church to go to, or how did that work?
Yeah, kind of. So my wife was also going through a similar journey of her own of, what did it mean to be a Catholic, and how important was that tradition to both her and to any future kids that we might have. And so we were kind of exploring this together. And so we went to, different local churches around us. We started, watching documentaries and reading books, and just kind of, I wouldn't say in a very serious way, academically looking into this, but certainly very serious for at the time, spiritually, trying to find, where it was that we belonged, our spiritual home, and what it meant for religion in our lives. And so that was really my first entry into the world of philosophy, because in this journey, I started kind of pulling on different threads. And what's so wonderful about the philosophy of religion is that it touches on so many different areas of philosophy. So you've got metaphysics, you've got ethics, you've got epistemology, you've got philosophy of history, you've got philosophy of science, you've got philosophy of mind. And so all of these were just strings that I started pulling on at various times, trying to understand what it meant to be a Christian. Obviously, me coming from a Protestant tradition and my wife coming from a Catholic tradition, what did that difference actually mean? What did it actually amount to? And how important was that divide? How important was the divide with, living in a religiously plural society? I was surrounded by many different denominations of my own faith, as well as, competing denominations like Islam and Judaism, Hinduism. And so what did all these things mean for my life and my own spiritual beliefs? And so I wouldn't say that there was any one moment where I lost my faith. It was definitely a very gradual shifting of sands, in the sense that I started to see the faith that I grew up in as kind of idiosyncratic and certainly off the beaten path, and certainly very conservative. And I eventually got to the point where I didn't think that the faith that I had been raised in aligned with where my political beliefs were. And so that was certainly one way in which the sand kind of started to shift underneath my feet. But then I do remember explicitly watching videos in the philosophy of religion from the site Closer to Truth. And there's a philosopher of religion, a famous philosopher of religion, J.L. Schellenberg. And at the time, I was really wrestling with what's known as the problem of evil. And so I was trying to come up with different solutions to kind of resolve the tension that is the problem of evil. Well, when I was watching the J.L. Schellenberg interview, and I don't know, this was probably around, I'd say 2011, 2012-ish, I was introduced to the argument from divine hiddenness, which J.L. Schellenberg is famous for having pioneered. And so I kind of saw it as this separate problem in addition to the problem of evil. And so I remember, thinking, well, I've tried to solve this one problem, but in doing so, I've just created this other problem. And so now I have two, not only do I not have a solution to this one problem, but now I have two problems to solve. And so I remember being very frustrated with that. I remember that was definitely a big shift for me, in the sense that I started to see science and philosophy as something that was fundamentally not going to be able to answer the questions that I was having and resolve the doubts. And so that was really one of my big philosophical turns in learning to cope with having doubts, and to learn with doubt, and to find the beauty in the doubt. And so that's about the same time too that I got my first philosophy mentor. So I'm here in Norfolk, Virginia, and the local university here is Old Dominion University. And so a philosopher of religion at ODU named Dr. William Brenner I started going to his little philosophy circles that he had at the local pubs. And he started giving me literature, kind of took me under his wing and helping me get things like Ludwig Wittgenstein and Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas under my belt. And he gave me a book that changed my life forever. And it was David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And so that was kind of the piece of literature that really clicked for me, because for Hume saw philosophy as generating problems within itself when it tries to solve problems. And so that's exactly what I had experienced with the J.L. Schellenberg. Like, by trying to solve using philosophy the problems that are raised with the problem of evil, not only did I not solve those problems, I created other intractable problems.
Well, but let me ask you a question though, because so when it comes to this school of thought, philosophy of religion, would you say that more philosophers of religion, and in this kind of published, like they have notoriety sense, are they believers or non-believers?
So I think most philosophers of religion are believers. So
Okay.
among philosophers, most philosophers are non-believers. However, once you get into the specialized domain of philosophy of religion, you find that atheist philosophers of religion are certainly the minority.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm saying this because of the fact that one of the observations that I've noticed, which is what gravitated to us getting to you coming onto my podcast, Ben, is I've noticed quite a bit of non-believers being really interested in philosophy of religion. And so I I don't want to make the mistake of necessarily going to a stereotype where, it's become a meme, at least in some theistic circles, where, oh, why are so many non-believers interested in philosophy of religion? You know what I mean? I don't know if that's true or not. That's why I wanted to ask you in good faith. You know what I mean?
So, no, I think it's a very good question, because certainly in our experience, people in what's known as the skeptic community have been rather hostile to not only the philosophy of religion, but just philosophy more generally. And so there is certainly within the skeptic community a sentiment or attitude or bias towards what is often called scientism. And so scientism is this idea that all of the questions that are really worth asking that can be answered are going to be answered by using methods of science. And so that a lot of philosophy is just for lack of a better term, useless. Now that's a very rough and probably unfair characterization of scientism, but that's certainly how you encounter it in practice. And so, like, one of the aims of our project is to bring serious philosophy to places like the skeptic community that certainly have a lot of respect for science. And so we want to make the argument that philosophy is more or less continuous with the projects of science. And so to really give skeptic community a better appreciation of philosophy. So,
Sure. Well, but I think one thing that's interesting though that you said that is because, right, in the scientism, or I think even just people that come across with the science is the best tool to make sense of everything, right?
Yeah.
Where some will go that you can only understand the world through science is in and of itself a truth claim, but yet the irony is that the truth claim cannot be analyzed by a science itself. So this is why I think it's so funny that
I think there's some pretty
those that say that are making a philosophical statement and not a scientific one, right? So
I think there's some pretty devastating objections to kind of the scientism attitude that are, like you just demonstrated, not very difficult to motivate. That if you just think about it for a little bit, you realize that the scientific methods presuppose a great deal of methods. So, mathematics is obviously the most obvious example here. Things like inductive reasoning, things like observations and how perceptions relate to the world. And so all of these are philosophical assumptions. And so there's no such thing. There's kind of this myth in the skeptical community that there's something like philosophy-free science. And so certainly the philosophy of religion circles I run in with other people, atheist philosophers of religion, we are very much opposed to that idea. We don't think that there is such a thing as philosophy science. We think there's just science whose philosophical assumptions have been ignored or taken on uncritically. I'm piggybacking off a Dennett Dennett quote here, and it's just the idea that philosophy is really foundational. Is really I think it's Wilfred Sellers who says that philosophy is our attempt to understand how things in the broadest sense of the word hang together in the broadest sense. And so what's going to connect things like epistemology, science, mathematics, the thing that's going to connect all of these disentangled forms of understanding are philosophy. And so that philosophy is going to have this very central role in understanding both ourselves and our place in the world. And the big questions that we can ask, like, what should I do? How do I know the things that I think that I know? What do I actually know? Are there things like God? How does religion fit into a life in theory and in practice? These are big questions that
of course,
I believe are intractable questions unless you bring some sort of philosophical methodology to trying to answer them. I don't think you can even begin to try to answer them in anything like a serious way.
Well, so let me ask you this, because obviously, right, we're backing up the train again. You're in this kind of doubting season in your life. You get super nerdy, geeky into philosophy to where you take on a mentor. Philosophy of religion becomes your jam, so to speak, in your interest and passion in this regard. And so, did the philosophical arguments help pull you further away from a belief in God to where you've settled that you now hold a non-belief position?
I think so, but it certainly wasn't that way in the beginning. It was definitely much more so the failure of the positive apologetics. So I was not impressed with people like Lee Strobel or Frank Turek, who were, keep in mind, in 2011, 2012, they were all the rage on YouTube. Back then, those were real, like the resources on YouTube were very, very limited. And so they were certainly the most popular. So I read Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. I read Frank Turek's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I was not impressed with those. So another fun fact about me is that I'm a close-up magician. Both my father and I do card tricks, coin tricks. And so I've been doing them since I was 5 years old. And so I've grown up in and that's actually one of the ways that I found my way into the skeptic community, is because a lot of people in the skeptic community are also part of what's called the IBM, the International Brotherhood of Magicians. And so
you better be careful using that word, Ben. Some of your old Quaker friends might think you're from the devil.
Yeah. So
not just the devil, to quote
one of the
Waterboy.
things that you learn very early on as a magician are sleight of hand and misdirection. And so sleight of hand is obviously using misdirection to pass off coins, double lift cards, all sorts of just different moves that you can use in magic to give the illusion that something has happened while in reality something else has happened. And so I felt like Lee Strobel and Frank Turek's work was sort of the philosophical equivalent of sleight of hand and misdirection. And so I knew that those weren't the foundation that I wanted for my faith. I wanted something more robust. I wanted something, and so certainly that my mentor that I mentioned, Dr. William Brenner, so he's a Wittgenstein scholar and an Aquinas scholar, so what's often called a Thomist. And so that's what I saw as something more serious, something that wasn't, it didn't feel like a sleight of hand or a misdirection. It felt like something built on a very serious philosophical tradition coming from ancient Greece with Aristotle and certainly other church fathers like St. Anselm and St. Augustine. And so that's where I started to gravitate towards. So philosophy of religion kind of pulled me in right there. And it was undermining those foundations that I think I finally around, I don't know, 2012, 2013, found myself kind of standing on the pile of ashes that was my previous faith. Like I pretty much pulled all the strings that I could pull on until I didn't really have anything left. And so I just really kind of had this negative philosophy. And so that's when I started trying to get into a more positive philosophy. And so that's when I started reading, people like Albert Camus. I started reading various other non-theistic religious traditions like the Tao Te Ching from Taoism, as well as contemporary non-theistic philosophy of religion, which is often called metaphysical naturalism. So in philosophical circles, probably the most widely accepted sort of meta-philosophy is metaphysical naturalism. And so that was the real, that was kind of where I started building up into what I would now call myself an atheist. And so when I say I'm an atheist, I mean something very specific by that. I don't just mean the, kind of.
You're not a lack theist, in other words?
Yeah, I'm not a lack theist. I don't just lack a belief in God. I'm saying that I believe that it's false, that there is such a person as God, where God is understood in a very specific way, as an unembodied person that has certain attributes like infinite power, infinite knowledge, infinite goodness, and is wholly worthy of our worship. And so I think that reality is fundamentally impersonal. So I'm not so quick, even though I'm an atheist, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I still think that there's an important role for religion to play in our lives. And so I think that it is part of human nature to have religious and spiritual beliefs of some sort, and for them to play a role in our lives. And so really one of my aims, at least with the Real Atheology project, is to ask, what can religion look like once we've rejected something like perfect being theism? Once we have said, hey, this theistic view is false, what can religion then look like? And so I've probably spent the past 10 plus years now really wrestling with that question, exploring things from panentheism to pantheism, to Hinduism, to Taoism, and then, of course, to reductive materialism, naturalism, ways in which I can cash out these metaphysical claims in ways that are intellectually satisfying. And like most other philosophers, I'm not entirely happy with where I am today in my own views, and I'm always tweaking them. I'm always discovering new questions. My inquiries are constantly generating more problems to solve than they are giving me satisfying answers in the end. And so,
so let me ask you a couple of different questions though, because so and thank you for that. Like that was like a really good, it sounds like a really interesting journey for you in terms of you were really on a mission to explore, and I kind of love that, because I used to be a non-believer, but I can tell you that in my atheistic season of my life, I was probably one of just more of those casual atheists. Like it was just more convenient to not believe than to believe, and I didn't really have the gumption to want to explore a more critical thinking path. My critical thinking exploration actually came about once I became a believer. And similar to you, like I uh, wanted to really understand the world and go exploring for it. And for me, it hasn't been in the philosophical side. Like I haven't like found a real nerdy geekness in philosophy. And I think that a lot of the arguments that have been said, and how many different ways can you kind of poke that bear, so to speak? To quote something biblical for a second, there's nothing new under the sun for God. And I think in this context, right, we've been seeing philosophical arguments come, back, like Thomas, for example, like that's centuries old, right? Aquinas is quite old. And so I think that there's been great thinkers thinking about where, sorry about my dog, thinking about where do we come from for a really, really long time. I think that's the age-old question, right? Where do we come from? That's the basic human curiosity. But one of the other things about yourself that, and I mean, you haven't talked about this yet, is you come from an engineering background. Like you studied mechanical engineering, correct?
Yes.
And so in this way, this is where I think you and I share a little bit of commonality. I'm not an engineer, but I come from a technology programming background myself. I'm in the technology field. And so my critical thinking came in the sense of, okay, well, now that I believe in God, how do I see God in the world? And beyond the Bible, what I've noticed is the advances that we've made in things like DNA, for example, right? The CRISPR tool, I think, is a little bit of a microcosm that kind of helps ground me in seeing the signature of God in our world, because DNA is a code. It just pretty much is. Like scientific papers even use that term to define what DNA is. So in my mind, right, and intelligent design people essentially start from that premise of, well, code comes from an intelligence. We're using human relatability here, obviously, right? And so since I'm not a philosopher, I only come from the defensibility of, well, how do I argue things from appeals to our human nature? And our human nature is we're thinkers, we're creators, we design stuff with intentionality. And even though some accidents happen, like the petri dish and discovering penicillin, for example, there's other things with deliberateness. Like, for example, you don't accidentally make a tank. A tank is a very deliberate, engineered tool that humans have made for the purposes of attacking something, right? Or the opposite would be the anti airplane defense systems that are meant to defend the ground from air attacks, aerial attacks, missile attacks, etc. Right? And so we know how to do things deliberately to create an outcome. And so for me, for example, the white blood cell, I just take it for instance, right? This is something that has a very deliberate purpose. That sucker is meant to defend our body, and it does a pretty ding dang good job of it. And so beyond just being scrambled ACTG to get a white blood cell, there's something else somewhere else that has imbued its functional code programming, so to speak, that it knows go defend. It doesn't do anything else but that. That's what its purpose is. Whereas a red blood cell, for example, it's meant to transport, right? So these proteins are assembling something with a specific outcome. And to me, that makes more sense in this whole coding comes from intelligence. That would make the worldview make more sense to me than are we a cosmic accident? And so while you definitely had your reasoning from the philosophical side, and that got you to a certain place, I don't know, I'm long-winded here, but I'm getting to the question, Ben. What does the engineering side of you have to say, right? Because the rib cage is a pretty darn good uh, protector of our lungs, for example, right? And so what would you say in terms of how do you look at the world from the engineering thing and not see, like I see in this case, code?
No, it's a really great question. So, to kind of give a little bit more background of, so I grew up definitely a very STEM type student. So science, technology, engineer, mathematics. So I always excelled in science and mathematics in school. And I was very, very big Lego nerd. As a kid, I was always building Legos and smashing them apart, putting them back together, building something new. And my dad also owned an auto shop. So I grew up working pretty much the majority of my teen years, learning how to turn wrenches, learning how to diagnose cars and take parts apart and put them all back together without any pieces left over. So it was a very natural gravitation for me in college into mechanical engineering, because I was a mechanic and I was really good at math. So mechanical engineering kind of, and my just love of puzzles. And so I feel like that's, if I've had one drive my whole life, it's been trying to work out puzzles and understand how things hang together in the broadest sense of the term, and understanding how to take things apart and how to put them back together. And so that was certainly one of the driving motivations for me in philosophy, is that this was just another type of puzzle. These questions pose puzzles, and I just wanted to figure out what the methodology was in order to solve these puzzles. And so the question that you've posed is often referred to as teleological reasoning, so, or what is an argument for design. So we observe order in the world, what Hume calls a curious adjustment of final causes in the world. So things seem to be for something else. And so then this for something else that things have is brought about by some intention. And so the question becomes, how do we explain that? How do we make sense of this apparent order in the world? And so I think there are three broad views that we can take to try to answer this question. And so the first is the most natural one, and is certainly the most historical one, and that has some form of theism. The idea that there are these intelligences in the world that use reason, analogous to a human mind, to bring about certain ends in the world. So the reason that our immune system is capable of defending us using antibodies and in certain very elegant and intricate ways is because a God with great power had the foresight to design us that way. And so the second view, I think, is the other end of that spectrum. And so that's what's typically called materialism or naturalism. That consists of mindless chance processes. So the process of biological evolution is a good example of this. So it says that we were selected by things like random variations in gene populations, and so that's a mindless process. And then that another mindless process, something like natural selection. So the idea that these random genetic mutations within certain ecological niches get selected for their fitness. And so that it's random, it's random genetic mutations with non-random selection processes in an environment over long periods of time that give rise to all of our biologically ordered features. And so the reason
certainly right, but but see, even those two statements, I believe, are more presuppositions and conclusions and not necessarily factual
this
statements.
This is one of the three views. So I think
Sure.
Broadly we can take, so the theistic view is incompatible with the materialist picture that I just painted. So if materialism is true, there's no being like God. However, if there is a God, then materialism can't be the whole story. There's more to the story than what materialism has the resources to explain. And so, but I think there's actually a third view. It's sort of a middle road between these two views as well. That's at least a live option on the table. And that's what's called natural teleology. And so it's the idea that, yeah, there might be mindless chance processes, and there might also be intelligences in the world that bring about certain ends. There's also a way in which the world tends because of some sort of value that they have. So the most common example of such a teleological view is what's called axiarchism. So it's the idea that the reason things exist and are ordered the way they are is because they're in some way good. It's good that the world would generate things like rational creatures that have immune systems. And so that this telos that naturally occurs in the world is what everything is naturally tending towards. And so I think those are the three broad views that we have to try to explain the order in the world. And so then the question becomes, how do we decide between these three views? Like you said, like there's presuppositions involved in all three of these views. And so there's going to be a certain amount of theoretical simplicity involved with each of them relative to one another. And there's going to be a certain amount of explanatory power relative to one of the others.
Wait, I want to bring it back down. You're getting way into the philosophy geeky stuff again.
Yeah, it's
I don't
very
want to
easy.
drift, and I don't want to drift too far from the meat and potatoes of my question. I want to bring it back to that, Ben. So, do you, as also an engineer, see or not see engineering in biology?
Well, so that it's going to depend on what you mean by engineering in biology. So do I see intelligent design in biology? Do I see
I'm not
something?
I'm not even gonna say that. Like I'll give kind of like I threw out one example, right? Like the rib cage, for example. Clearly, that thing is built to protect our lungs and our heart, core systems, right? The breastplate, for example.
It's
So
ordered. It's ordered to protect us. So it's
right.
not. It was non-randomly came about.
Even how it arises, even how it arises. That does not mean I find that interesting. I'm saying when you see the rib cage, it doesn't not have like a deliberate purpose to it. Is it not a pretty darn well built system to protect the lungs
It has
and
a
the heart?
curious adjustment of ends. So it has features that cry out for an explanation. And so
Yeah.
like, I would certainly concede that. It's something that that we can ask, okay, well, how did this come about? We don't want to say that it was the product of uniform chance. We don't want to say that the rib cage just popped into existence. There was a time T1 where there were no rib cages, and then a time T2 shortly after that where boom, there were rib cages. I don't think anyone would be satisfied with that.
No, and I'm not that person either. Like since
Yeah.
I come from programming background, for example, I'm okay with thinking in like the whole random mutation, natural selection. The way I reinterpret that in my brain, coming from this lens, is I look at it as iterative programming in the sense of you had skeleton version 0.1 and we're now at version 1000.22. You know what I mean? And so like there was myriad iterations to get us here. Like I concede that, but I guess where I'm going with this is
Well,
whether
when
it's
I
a
see
rib cage or whether it's seeing like the one of my favorite dinosaurs was the Triceratops, right, with his big
yeah.
giant shield and his horns. It's like those are pretty darn good defense things too, and that's kind of where I'm going. Is that
Well, when I see
those
something
look
like
like that?
rib cage, or I see something like the spines of a stegosaurus, I see something that is in need of explanation. And so I want to
Right.
then ask, is this what best explains this observation? Is it intention? Is it teleology? Or is it mindless chance? And so that's the question. I see the same observations that you do, and I concede them. And I can see the curious adjustments of final causes in all of these things. But then the question becomes, do I see this as the product of intention? Do I see this as the product of teleology? Or do I see this as the product of mindless chance? And so at one point in my life, I saw it as the product of intention. When I was a Christian and a theist, I certainly saw these as something that God intended. And that was the lens in which I understood these observations. These observations were more intelligible to me through that explanatory theorizing. Now that I am no longer a Christian or theist, and as a philosopher, I see them as the product of mindless chance processes. I see them as something that was selected for by random mutations and environmental selection pressures, which I concede are mindless chance processes. However, I am still currently open to the idea that there are teleological principles that in their logical form are teleological, that explain these things as well. But I am an atheist, so I do not see a minded intention in reality anymore. That's not to say that I am closed to the idea that something like intelligent design might be the best explanation of some future observation. We might make some observation in the future where we go, okay, this just seems like something intelligently designed. So Hume uses a really great...
Wait.
Oh, go ahead.
Because I want to also be mindful of our clock here. So that you say a mindless process is what settles it for you. But
that is what I think is the best explanation for the biological order.
No, I get it. So this is why I kind of wanted to throw something else at you, because when I spend time marinating on this, like I really like spend time thinking this up, and so I'm just going to walk you through kind of one of my, my sitting down, just thinking about like how all this works. And so if we take the dimensions of the liver, for example, right? And I'm using terms because I think, again, as an engineer, you would understand things have certain dimensions, right? You got to build the buildings to a certain spec, right? And so the liver, right, being made of a specific type of protein to have a specific outcome, the protein has to imbue all of those processes into the cells of the liver, but then also the liver is going to be a particular shape. And I've thought about it down to where, like, when the liver is finalizing its construction, there's the very last cell at the very tip of the end corner of the liver, and then no mas. Like the liver's not continuing to grow. It stopped at a particular dimension. Something told it to stop, right? Just like the tip of your nose, for example, right? Our nose is continuing to grow like Pinocchio. There is something in the code that says, bruh, this is the cell number 2,557,000 of your skin is the very last cell, and I'm going to put that right at the tip of your nose. So this is kind of what I mean is that can be satisfactorily answered with a quote mindless process. That's where I just can't understand like how that doesn't continue to pose more questions instead of being a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, so that's fair. So to kind of back up and give an idea of what I mean by a mindless chance process. So the theory of biological evolution is that complex organisms and their biological features, like their livers and their immune systems and the defense spiky protections of a stegosaurus, are the gradually modified biological features of relatively simple organisms. So this is a theory of descent with modification. And so there's transgenerational change centered at a genetic level. So the idea that there are populations of genes, and that all of the evolutionary changes that gave rise to our livers, our immune systems, and the horns of stegosauruses are changes in the complexity of those organisms that resulted from transgenerational genetic changes in a population. And so what that means is that there were random mutations from generation to generation. And within those random mutations within the populations of genes, certain genes were selected in environmental niches by environmental pressures. And so that's what explains the order that we see in all of these things. Well, why does it use this protein rather than that protein? Well, because at some point in the biological history, natural selection selected beings that had organs that used this protein rather than that protein. And that over time, and that's what explains what's often called morphology. So morphology is the similarity that we have with other organisms. So the liver of the materials and the geometry, like you say, of the liver are very, very similar to those that we find in chimpanzees and bonobos and other higher primates. And so what helps explain these similarities between these species? Well, it's going to be descent with modification. If we postulate that we shared a common ancestor 100,000, 200,000 years ago, that's what explains the similarity between their organs and our organs. And what has changed over time has been the environmental and selection pressures. And so that's what explains the slight differences between our organs and those of other higher primates. And so that's just one line of evidence for the theory of biological evolution. So I think there are other things that this theory helps us explain. So this is what I mean by explanatory power. So I think the scope of these mindless chance processes is much greater than intelligent design. So I think that we can explain things like observations in the fossil record. I think we can explain things like biogeography. And I think we can explain things, certain observations and things like molecular biology.
Well, but again, I think that those things provide some answer to biodiversity. I think that's very reasonable to conclude, but like my geekiness was buried down into the weeds level of detail, right? In the sense of, right, the liver has dimensions, right? When the DNA is going and creating the protein for the liver, it's making X amount of cells that are exclusively for the liver. Let's just use the word a million for a second. Let's say the liver is composed of a million cells. Well, why not 1,000,001? Why not 500,000? Like something is inclusive in the instruction set that says, hey, go make this protein that's going to get me a liver that does X, Y, Z, and oh, by the way, make it 1,000,000. And this is kind of what I mean. This level of specificity in order to construct it, and I'm using terms that hopefully relate to your engineering brain again, Ben. Like to me, these things, that they're the answer of that's an evolutionary process, or we get that from looking at the fossil record. I don't think that answers my question at all, honestly.
Okay, so let me try to put it this way then, and maybe we can see it from a different angle. So that's just how biological evolution is meant to explain these observations. So but let's instead consider the theistic hypothesis. And it's going to say that, look, all of this order that we observe is because it is explained by the thoughts or ideas in the mind of a deity. And so we're saying that the order is found in God's mind, like the plan of an architect for a house is found in the architect's mind. The architect has an ordered mind, and it's ordered in the shape of a house. And so that's how the architect is then able to go and build a house. Similarly, a deity has the plan of an immune system and the dimensions and materials of a liver and goes and builds a liver. That's what I take to be the explanation from theism. But what we're saying there is that there is an inherent principle of order in mind, so that ideas just fall, the order of the liver, the order of the immune system within the mind just falls into place of itself. So if the order in the material world requires an explanation or cause, I would also say that the order within a mind requires a cause. Well, if you're going to say there is no cause for the order in God's mind, it just falls into order of itself. Why can't we also equally say, well, there's certain features of the material world in which orders just fall into order of itself? There's an inherent principle of order in the material world. And so why would that be a preferable move? Well, here's one reason. Because if the material world requires order, and we're explaining that order with the order of God's mind, well, then we need some explanation of the order of God's mind. Well, if you say, no, I was going to stop with the order in God's mind and have an inherent principle of order in God's mind, well, why go so far? Why not just have stopped at the material world in the beginning? At some point, we agree that we can't have just an infinite cause of explanations for order. And so if we're going to say that there's an inherent principle of order somewhere, why not just stop with the material world? Why add something over and above the material world that is like our minds? Because at that point, this is one of the points Hume makes, is we're guilty of a gross impartiality. We've made our minds the model for the whole universe, whereas we should instead think of the universe as its own model, and we are a feature within it.
But but then we're just getting to that whole, like, what I call, like, infinite regress, right? Which is the
we don't want an infinite regress.
You want to say yes, since there's the unmoved mover, well, why can't I use that and say nature / the universe is the unmoved mover, and then you get in the whole, like, there's the multiverse, or
in this case, we're just saying the material world. Whatever, we both agree, any plausible worldview is committed to the existence of the material world. There are material objects. Here's my phone. Here's a remote. There are material objects. So we're all committed to a realm of material objects. And so we want to explain, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we observe order in the world? That's what we're trying to explain with an immune system or a liver. We want to explain that order. At some point, in order to avoid the infinite regress, we have to say that there's an inherent principle of order somewhere. Either it's in God's mind or it's in the material world itself. And so if we're already committed to a material world, why go above the material, over and above the material world, to then place that principle of inherent order? Why not just say that principle of inherent order is in the material world? And that in that principle of inherent order is one of the things that gave rise.
But isn't that committing a circular reasoning fallacy then?
Well, there's no circular reason. It's no more circular than if we gave the inherent principle of order to God's mind. So again, we're comparing two different.
But we're not though, because
we're trying to explain order. We want to explain the order we observe without
certainly right. But we as humans have the capacity to have something, again, with deliberate purpose and intentionality. Like, again, I'll go back to the tank analogy, or construct a building, create an iPhone, write a novel, make a movie. These things are not in and of themselves an accident, right? Even the science of baking is specific instructions to get a specific outcome.
Yeah, they're the product of human reasoning. So just like the architect built the house, a computer.
But what I'm saying is that we have myriad examples of how doing something prescriptive gets us an outcome, and it's you don't bake a cake just by randomly throwing some flour and some sugar and just stick it in an oven, and then next thing you know, you've got a 17-layer wedding cake, right? You had to have a specific way to get the 17-layer cake. And all I'm saying is that we can make countless and countless examples from the human experience, because we do it all the time. And so if I'm understanding what you're saying, is you're saying that when we see these comparable things in biology, that all of a sudden we can take that default framework, that default understanding and instead replace it with a mindless process as the root cause of it, or the mechanism behind it, the engine that runs it, and that is a satisfactory explanation. And all I'm saying is that it's an explanation. The world clearly accepts it. All I'm saying is that at some point, isn't it too much of a peanut butter spread? And there's not enough further questions to say, well, can it really be mindless? Because, like, for example, and I'll kind of leave it with this, because we could spend all day talking about this. I saw this TED talk where this brilliant guy was showing how in our advancements in technology, we've gotten to the point to where we can really understand what's happening at the cell at almost the nano level, right? Like this kind of like biological nanobots that are literally walking around looking like freaking robots doing micro discrete tasks within the cell mechanism itself. It's so fascinating. And I'm like, to me, the further that we look and explore biology, the more we see these discrete tasks, these deliberate things, the enzyme that unzips the DNA, for example. That's that sucker's whole job is to do that. And yet to just say, well, that's a byproduct of a natural mindless process. I'm just like, okay, if you say so, bro.
So maybe thinking of it this way might help kind of see where I'm coming from. So we would certainly agree that we observe the effects of reason. So there's ordered effects of reason. So the architect uses reason and as a cause, and one of the effects that we observe from reason is a house. I think we would both agree that humans use what we call reason to build ordered things. So order can come from reason, but order can also come from generation. So the reproduction between two people. We all know that order can come from generation and reason. We also know that order can come from vegetation. So seeds grow into flowers, produce more seeds. They grow, they get pollinated, go off, grow, come again. So we know that order can come from vegetation, generation, and reason. So have we ever observed generation or vegetation come from reason? Have we ever been able to, in a lab, be able to create life? The answer to that would be no. We haven't done that yet. We might sometime in the future. We haven't quite figured out how to create life. Reason, we've never seen life come from principles of reason as a cause. But now, have we ever seen reason come from generation or vegetation? Well, yes, you and I are capable of reason. Those came from generation. Our parents copulated, we were born, so we know that reason can come from generation. But we've never seen generation come from reason. So based on our experience alone, we know that order can fall in of itself from mindless chance processes, or at least from causes of which we are unknown to us. We don't quite understand everything that has to do with generation and vegetation. But we don't have any idea of how to create generation and vegetation from reason. So we know the former can come from the latter, but the latter can't come from the former. And so based on that, when you see things like the microbiological world of cells and all kinds of little critters down there floating around and doing all sorts of neat little things, what from our experience have those sorts of things come from? What sort of causes have caused those sorts of things? Is it vegetation, generation, or reason? We don't have any experience of something like that coming from reason, but we do have experience of things like that coming from generation and vegetation. And so what I've given here is kind of a proto-biological evolutionary explanation. So all of the order and complexity that we observe in that microbiological world is explained by the same mindless chance processes to explain the order that you see at our macro level. And so I think that that's very powerful way of seeing the explanatory power and the limits to which we can attribute things like human reason. So human reason help us understand causes at our macro level. But are we going to be able to extend principles of reason that are so common in our everyday life to the very, very small micro levels or the very, very large macro levels, cosmic levels? I think that's where we're going to get in trouble. I think that's where we've gotten well beyond the reliability of our faculties. We've gone beyond what reason is going to be able to tell us. We can at most speculate about the causes, both on the cosmic level and on the micro level. So, and certainly that's what we find in the natural sciences. So like you said, it's an interesting speculation, the multiverse, but we don't actually have any empirical evidence for a multiverse. We've here gone quite beyond the reach of our faculties. And quantum mechanics on the other end of this, very, very small. Again, if anyone tells you that they understand quantum mechanics, they're lying to you. No one understands quantum mechanics. That's one of the interesting things about quantum mechanics, is that all we can really do at this point is observe the things that we do and speculate about how to understand that micro level. And so we know that our reasoning just has limits. Gotcha. And so I think the more we discover about the cosmic scale, and I think the more that we discover about the micro quantum scale, I think the further we move away from what we would call human mentality and human reason. The human reason is a late and local feature of biological organisms. And that when we go down to those quantum levels and up to those cosmic levels, you don't find anything that resembles what we would call a human mind. You don't find decisions being made at the cosmic level. I don't think that we see intentions down in the quantum scale. I think those are seen at the scale of you and me. And so that's the model in which I think is closest to the truth. Now, am I open to there being something over and above this? I am. I want to say that I am. But that those worries beforehand of, okay, well, if I postulate this order over and above the material world, how do I stop that infinite regress? Well, if I stop that infinite regress with an inherent principle of order, that God's ideas just fall into order of themselves, how much better of an explanation is that than just me attributing that inherent principle of order to the material universe in the first place? Why go so far? And the other piece of this, from the engineering standpoint, I want to circle back because I know that your original question had to do with engineering. So when I observe engineered objects, there are two properties of engineered objects that I think stand out to me: simplicity and efficiency. So human design doesn't want complexity, it wants simplicity, because it wants to be able to repeat things. It wants to be able to understand things and put things in as few movements and pieces as possible. And I also see efficiency. So we don't want to waste things. We don't want to use more resources than are necessary. We don't want to have more energy than what it takes. And so when I look into the world and I see the order in the world, do I see, especially in biological beings, do I see simplicity and do I see efficiency? Well, I do in certain areas. I would say that our cardiovascular systems are efficient. I would say that the mechanics of our bodies, the degrees of motion that we have, are simple. We find simple movements in different animals. But I also find a lot of complexity. I find a ton of complexity in biological beings and inefficiencies. I see ways in which if I was an intelligent designer, I wouldn't have done it that way, because that way is very, very inefficient. I wouldn't have brought about conscious creatures over millions of years of biological evolution. That just seems very, very inefficient. I would not have used so many different mechanisms in certain biological creatures. I would have made them as simple as possible. I wouldn't have what are called vestigial organs. So we have, I think the science might have changed in this in a little while, but the standard example was our appendix. So we all have an appendix that doesn't seem to have biological use. It's vestigial. And so that seems very complex for no reason. That gives rise to inefficiencies. And so that to me seems like the product of a mindless chance process. Or possibly a teleological principle, that there was something, nature tended towards something, and that's just kind of the offshoot that's left over somehow. But do I see that as the product of an intelligent designer? I'm skeptical. It seems to me that if I had knowledge and power, and that was going to explain this order by mind similar to that of a human, that's not what we would observe. That's very surprising. And so I think that the mindless chance processes give us a theoretically simpler explanation of those inefficiencies and complexities that we observe, while also having a great explanatory scope. I'll turn things back over. I know I got a little winded there.
No, it was good. I don't necessarily agree. Obviously, we come from
That's fair,
different
yeah.
schools of thought, but I totally followed your train of thinking, and I guess the way I was trying to think about what you were saying in terms of observations, and we'll kind of land the plane here, but it's like one kind of counter thing I could pose your way is if you were the transistor on a motherboard observing the entire landscape of the motherboard, you would certainly conclude, man, I see no evidence of an iOS platform. I don't know what the heck you're talking about, bro. It doesn't mean
It's
clearly that the iOS
possible.
platform doesn't exist or isn't running just hunky-dory. It's happening in parallel, right? So,
but I think that's a skeptical situation that we all have to deal with, in the sense that our experience, the range of experience that we have, is limited, and so we might only be like you said, we might be looking at a very small corner of the motherboard, and that if we were able to just have a wider perspective, we would be able to see the whole motherboard much clearer and go, oh, okay, now you. This is why I think
the metaphor,
philosophy
the
requires me to be
comparison I was
open.
making was that the landscape would still only be that of the hardware, and it would say nothing about the software, right? That's kind of more where I was going with that. Try to leave you with some food for thought,
Yeah,
right? Right. And so,
yeah.
don't get me wrong, Ben. I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. We could probably chop this up to go on for hours, but we've been at this a minute, and I want to be mindful of time. So.
You're right.
So let me leave you with the closer here. Again, you are with you and your co-hosts run the Real Atheology podcast website, YouTube channel. So for folks that might be curious and might want to check that out, tell us how we can learn more about Real
Wherever
Atheology.
you get your podcasts, we have some sort of presence on it. We're on YouTube. Like you said, we have a website. We're also on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it these days, Facebook. Look us up. We have interviews with professional philosophers of religion, both of theist and atheist persuasions. And so we hope that the 50 or so episodes that we have out will be of interest to certain people and help give them the tools they need to think about these big questions in serious ways. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Ben, it was so great to have you on, man. I had a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right, gang, that's it for this episode. If you like my content, please consider subscribing to my channel. God bless you guys.